rest of it is history. The second part of Jay that no one knows about is sort of people know about if you really follow him. He's an avid reader and a self-learner in a lot of subjects. Computational photography, I have no idea what that is. Macro and microeconomics, comparative philosophy, astronomy, futurism, singularity, and all of that. Two things, Jay. One, how does your wife like about the fact that you work 12-hour days and then do self-studies? Things hopefully are good at home. And then tell us about a little bit about how you hired Sachin and Benny and how that whole story happened.
Okay, yeah. On the first part, I think, yeah, more than my wife, I would say I think I need to bribe my kids quite a bit. Spend a lot of time with them over the weekend for all the absence during the weekdays at least. But yeah, I mean, the Sachin Benny story, I mean, they're of course bright, fresh engineering talent out of top tier school, and at that time we were setting up and scaling Amazon, and we did hire both of them, as well as a lot of other folks who have now gone on to become CXOs, founders, running very successful companies. I think it was a fantastic team that we built up at Amazon. Very proud of having been a part of that team. Yeah. That's how that happened.
All right, and how do you keep up with so much things? What are your top areas, top topics that you study today? Today, what did you read this week?
This week, right now I'm reading a book called Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom. He is one of my favorite philosophers and authors. He publishes a lot of papers. He's a big believer in futurism and transhumanism, and he's one of the folks who have raised kind of a halcyon cry that we need to figure out how we chart the path towards development in artificial intelligence, especially as we seem to be heading towards artificial general intelligence, AGI, which pretty much is the starting point for the singularity event, right? So yeah, that's something that I'm reading right now. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about a couple of things. I mean, I was looking at your resume. You seem to have done two things that sort of are a bit contrarian, which is you went to the US, got into grad school. Most of us who have no idea what to do in the future end up doing that. I did that. I hung around for a PhD because I had absolutely no idea what to do with my future. But you seem to have figured out very quickly that you needed two masters, double masters, and work for a tiny company back in those days with 1,000 people called Amazon, right? And then you came back to India with that tiny company to yet another tinier outfit with Amit, I think. 4 people shop in the Varsity Chambers. Tell me how those two things happened.
Yeah, I mean, on the contrary, I mean, I did not have things figured out. I think just like any other kid in a typical middle class family in India, there are only two choices that you have, right? You either get into engineering, if you're good at math, or if you're good at drawing and biology, you get into medical, right? So I kind of sort of like just followed the flow and got into engineering, never really figured why I wanted to do engineering and whatnot, right? It's just what your parents wanted to do, all of your peers were doing, so just go do it, right? So the only thing I knew was I really liked math, so I said, okay, I want to do something where I feel there is a lot of math involved. So that's definitely, so my bachelor's was actually in mechanical engineering, not even in computer science. Then when I went for my master's in the US, again, I wanted to do something in fluid dynamics, computational fluid dynamics, because that again is something that has a lot of math, an interesting math at that. In fact, Navier-Stokes equations, which form the basis of of fluid dynamics, is one of the unsolved, big unsolved problems in the Clay Millennial Math Prize, actually, if you're interested in looking it up and maybe take a crack at creating an analytical solution for it. So anyway, so that's how I ended up doing fluid dynamics. But as I was doing it, I was trying to solve physical problems using computing because there were no analytical solutions, right? So you needed to actually use computing, massively parallel programming paradigms, etc. And then I realized that I really was very interested in the actual algorithms and the whole parallel programming paradigm, the computer architectures and all of that stuff. So I said, okay, fine. I mean, I've put in 6 years of my life into mechanical engineering and fluid dynamics. And of course, I could have gone into a career in that field. But because I just really felt the passion for knowing more about this very interesting field, right? So one of the very first courses I did was algorithms, a lot of discrete math, and it was just like really fascinating. So then I said, okay, I do want to actually shift into computer science. Did another master's in computer science. Then interned at Amazon. This was pre-2000, during that crash, right? So, and then joined Amazon, worked there for a few years, came to India to set up the Amazon India R&D Development Center as part of the founding team, and then, yeah, subsequently a few other things happened, yeah.
Right. And that looks like in your resume, beside the Amazon, Yahoo, Flipkart, Myntra, back to you again, Flipkart, there exists a company called eClinic 24/7. That's your entrepreneurial journey, right? Tell us a little bit about how did you, you sort of look like you were the e-commerce guy, for lack of better words, but you suddenly took a side turn, went into healthcare, I would say, in a broader sense, and then built a startup. How did that happen? What was the inspiration? How did you do it? What did you learn from that?
Yeah, I would say that has been one of the most terrific in the recent past experiences I've had. I think the reason I went into it as after about almost I would say 15 years or so doing lots of different consumer internet platforms. Of course, starting with e-commerce, AWS, then of course digital media, and at Yahoo and various things, so platforms, private cloud, video, geo platforms, bunch of things like that. All in the context of either consuming content or consuming products, right? So, and I was in India already at that time for more than 10, 11 years or thereabouts, right? So I kept having this feeling that in terms of use of technology for something that is also very socially relevant for the Indian context, we are kind of missing the boat, right? So then I started researching education and healthcare were two sectors that I was very passionate about, where I thought that there was also a need in the society and in the market, and also there was a lot of white space areas. For various reasons, I just eventually trudged it down to healthcare, and that's how my startup journey started. So set up a telemedicine platform, had both a B2B line of business and B2C. And we raised funding, we had revenues, and eventually also sold the company, sold the assets in the company to this company called MedLife, which is the largest e-pharma company in India today. So and in terms of learnings, I think a lot of learnings. Obviously, I was a core techie doing tech product for about 15 years, and as a startup founder, you kind of like double hat, triple hat, and quadruple hat and more, right? So I was doing BD, sales, I was doing marketing, setting up campaigns and running it, of course doing fundraising. So it was just like a torrent of learning, right? And very interestingly, I think, of course, I attended all of these sessions around how do you, like as an entrepreneur, how do you do the right things? I read every book possible. Eric Ries, Lean Startup, and you can name it, I would have probably read it, HBR articles, whatnot. And then promptly after that proceeded to make my own mistakes in my startup. But yeah, I think it's an interesting learning. I mean, we did get a reasonable exit for the startup, but those 3 years when I was actively running it and then subsequently trying to engineer a sale and exit for the platform, were very interesting. I think in terms of understanding your users better, narrowing your focus for the product, and how do you close sales cycles? It was just like, I wouldn't do justice to it in the very few minutes we have left, so I will not try, but yeah, a lot of learnings.
Let's not worry about the minutes. We started 10 minutes later, we get 10 minutes extra. So yes, so startups are great learning ground. One of my sort of mentors is a guy called Dave Morgan, who sold world's first media company, digital media company, 24/7 Real Media. Dave has subsequently sold 3 companies, each above $500 million. So he's on to his 4th company. So I said, Dave, now that you have run 3 companies, you not make any mistakes anymore. He said, that's correct. Hopefully I would not make the mistakes that I have made before, but I'm sure I'll make a whole new set of mistakes since it's another startup. Startups are great learning grounds. No matter how many times you do, you will end up learning something new on the next round one. Now let's move to the next anticipated topic that sort of everyone is thinking of probably. Let's talk about Indian consumers. So let's use the example of Flipkart and Myntra. When people think Flipkart and Myntra, they say it's an e-commerce company, but in reality, there are two different types of company. One is a horizontal e-commerce, which is, Flipkart sells everything from mobiles, clothes, washing machines, furnitures, you name it. Myntra, on the other hand, is a very, very deep vertical e-commerce company. I have two questions for it. One is, how do consumers behave differently with their horizontal e-commerce versus their vertical e-commerce? The second question would be, having been there for almost 10 years now, how do you see Indian consumer behavior on e-commerce evolving?
Yeah, great question. So I think on the horizontal commerce versus vertical commerce categories, right? I think being a vertical commerce player, you have the platform to do a lot of very focused innovation on, let's say in our case, lifestyle, fashion, beauty, personal care, and so on and so forth, right? So even though beauty, personal care, we started a bit late, but lifestyle and fashion, we were by far the market leaders, right? So I think in terms of consumer behavior, there are a few differences. In a core commerce platform, horizontal commerce platform, typically the focus tends to be that you've already narrowed down to some extent something that you want to buy. You may not have finalized the exact choice, but you know that you want to buy a mixer grinder or a TV or something, right? You may not buy it immediately, but you have a very strong intent already when you're coming there, right? So, people generally today, at least, don't come to commerce companies for inspiration, engagement, etc. Right? So, in terms of the pre-decision research and the inspiration, they go elsewhere. Right? It could be friends and family. It could be online influencers they follow, celebrities or whatnot. Right? And then they come to the platform to transact. Maybe get the best selection, the pricing, and convenience and whatnot. Right? So, I think. But so the focus there is more on conversion, right? And how do you actually give them the information that they need without making them go through a lot of things? With the minimum number of clicks, how are you able to convert them? And of course, during the conversion, you will try all your cross-sell, upsell, and everything, right? But the conversion is a focus. But in a category like lifestyle and fashion, people do come for inspiration and engagement, right? So a lot of time you will see user behavior where they may come and, in fact, be very engaged with your platform, come very often, but don't convert. It does not necessarily mean, though, that they find something lacking or the selection is not there or whatever, right? So it's just they come there for inspiration. So it's a very browse-oriented category as opposed to a conversion-oriented category. So that's a big difference in how you even approach product features and what is your outlook as a product manager when looking at funnel analytics, sessions, users and user studies and all of it, right? So higher the engagement, higher the user's long-term value is. And the focus therefore is more on engagement. In that sense, it becomes more similar to typical daily engagement kind of properties, be it a video property or any other social media category, right? So that is I would say a big difference. Of course, the horizontal commerce usually, if you take any vertical, it's the repeat rates are typically not as high, except maybe the general merchandise and the home kind of thing, right? So like your mobiles, electronics, consumer durables, and whatnot, right? So you would not have that many repeat purchases in a year, but on lifestyle fashion, usually the TPCs, the transactions per customer, is higher. So I think investing in your users and the user experience so that they consider you as a daily destination for engaging becomes very, very important in a vertical kind of a play. So those are some differences I could think of. Yeah.
So on to the second question. How do you see the Indian consumer, how have you seen the Indian consumer behavior evolving?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the Indian consumer base that has been on e-commerce platforms and maybe including online travel, etc., right? So leaving out IRCTC maybe, but the rest of it, right? So usually that cohort is typically tier 1 customer, metro customer, and some part of tier 2. The penetration in tier 2 and 3 has been fairly lower until I would say about a couple of years or so, right? When it has been exponentially picking up. Today, we actually see, based on our analytics, that 90% of all the new users we are acquiring on the platform are actually from tier 2 and 3 cities, right? So I think more than the consumers as an individual evolving, of course that also happens, they become more familiar with the platform over time. So the constructs feel more natural to them. So we as a platform now need to evolve to address this new cohort of users that are coming on our platform, right? So I talked about in the other panel some of the examples of how the customers' understanding of core commerce concepts is very different. And the devices they access the platform with, the level of connectivity, speed, etc. that they have on it, and the resolution on the devices, etc. are very different, right? Just actually, I would love to understand something from this audience, right? So if you look at the mobile OS share in India, right? How many people think, so which one do you think is the second largest mobile operating system in India today? How many of you think that it's Android? Show of hands. Second largest. Yeah, so second largest, how many of you, so Android clearly it's not, it's the first, right? So second largest, how many of you think it's iOS? Okay, a good number of folks. So the folks who didn't put up their hand, like, can anyone say what they think is the second largest OS? So I couldn't hear all the responses, but it's actually KaiOS. KaiOS has actually overtaken very recently iOS as the second largest mobile
answer, and the second largest operating system right now, I actually did not know. When I was running Facebook's EMP in 2014, the second largest was Symbian. And a lot of people didn't know. A lot of engineers who were working in the group hadn't actually thought of that being the second largest operating system, right? Next question. This theme of this event is scale at speed. And it means different things to different people, to tech, to data, to products. You have essentially gone across all three sort of areas. You are a technologist, you work with data, you have built products. From your perspective, how do you think about speed at scale?
Yeah, I think, so while we are Flipkart, people think that we have already traversed that 0 to 10 and 10 to 100 kind of a scaling pathway, right? But that said, there are a lot of new verticals that we actually invest in, a lot of new channels that we invest in. For example, very recently we actually invested in building our own engagement destination. So I earlier talked about how typically commerce platforms are seen more as transactional platforms and not as a place where people go to get inspired and engaged and discover new things in context, not through merchandising, but through actually organic discovery through, let's say, influencers that they like and follow or whatnot, right? So we launched a product called Flipkart Ideas. It's available pretty much for everyone on the mobile platforms. And we launched Flipkart Videos, which is available today only on Android, but soon will be also on iOS. So these are new platforms for us. So here we are talking about 0 to 1 and 1 to 10 kind of a scaling phase, right? So one of the things is when you're at that phase of scaling is when you can do a lot of mistakes. You can do a lot of experiments, you can learn from it, and then pivot your product as you need to suit your customers' market needs. Of course, before you invest in a product, you still do a lot of research on the ground, talking to your users, talking to your customers. You do ethnographic studies, a lot of field studies, and you talk to users. And of course, you do your design boards and storyboarding and everything, right? While coming up with a hypothesis and building a minimum viable product. But then eventually, rapid experimentation, iteration, making mistakes, learning from it is what is the important part of that 0 to 1, 1 to 10 kind of a scaling phase. After that, it's about having structured processes to continue to innovate on top of what you have built. So you continue to discover even latent needs of the users. So typically the early product market fit establishment phase, it can happen, but it's rarely about discovering latent needs. Sometimes these are about explicit needs but unmet needs. That's what you're trying to actually address. But once you have enough traction, then you look at what could be latent needs that now I could invest in, right? And of course, at every stage there are tools, processes, methodologies that you can use to do structured innovation and continue to invest in delighting your users and building the best-in-class customer experience. So,
all right. So, in the early days when the Indian startup ecosystem started getting built up, roughly about 10 years back, starting with Flipkart and few other companies, our inspiration was West, right? We looked at e-commerce, we are doing food delivery and so on. The system is kind of maturing right now. It's been 10 years. There are about 5,000 to 6,000 startups in the country now. What do you think some of the areas where what I would call is a Bharat innovation can happen? Innovation for solving India problems, right? What are some of the areas if there are entrepreneurs in this audience that they would like to think about starting a company on, what would be your advice on that?
I think a lot of very India-specific problems that we as an industry still really need to solve. For example, just a couple of them that I would just mention here, right, is logistics and especially last mile is still a unsolved problem in my opinion. Right, so especially, for example, address intelligence is a big problem in India, right? So addresses are completely unstructured. Very, very difficult to locate an address that is specified by an user, right? So usually it'll be like behind that gully, next to that temple, whatnot, right? So it's just like incredibly difficult to make sure that you don't breach delivery promises when you have very, very hazy addresses, right? So we don't have a very well laid out grid structure for, and these are not planned cities. Many of them are like unplanned cities that grew in haphazard ways, right? So that's something that we have, of course, internally invested in a lot in building address intelligence, developing the polygon boundaries based on tokenization of addresses, doing autocorrection of addresses, and of course explicitly capturing lat long for users at the delivery time so that we can map it back to the address that was given by the user, right? And developing address intelligence. So that is one big area I would say. Vernacular is another big area. I think India is a country with so much diversity that every pocket of the country is like a separate country market by itself, right? Compared to many Southeast Asian countries, you would think that you have very, very varied customer dynamics, which ranges from even selection being different, catalog needs to be different for that area, and the importance of different parameters. So we do NPS studies with customers, both offline and online modalities through which we administer the customer NPS surveys, right? So we also try to gauge importance of different factors like delivery speed versus pricing versus selection versus various other things, right? Customer care and so on and so forth, right? So I think, so we see very different patterns from different sectors of our customer base. So lot of work needs to happen still in the vernacular space, understanding like mixed mode, code mixing solutions, chatbots, assisted commerce, social, etc. Right? So these are a lot of areas with very wide open areas. I don't think anybody has fully cracked some of these things. Of course, we are making our own attempt as well. So we acquired a company called Live.ai about a year back, which has done some really pioneering work in this space. We are continuing to invest, but these are interesting problem spaces which are very India specific that are still fairly open for startups to take a crack at.
Thanks, Jay. I'll do one more questions, and before we open it up to the audience for Q&A, I'm sure a lot of you want to ask questions, specifically, related to all the topics that we have covered so far. Last question. There are two ways to design your products, right? One is design thinking. It's like Airbnb when you are iteratively building a product, understanding what the customer wants, and sort of going and building the product. The second approach is what WeChat takes, which is called the grand design, which is I know everything about the user. There is a new way of doing things. I'll go build a product and I'll get the users get used to it. Which one do you think for a market like us is a better way to build a product, design thinking or grand design?
I think these A versus B questions are always very tricky because I'm sure there are proponents of both in the audience, right? So what I would say is, I think definitely structured ways of doing innovation. I know that in the recent past, design thinking has copped a lot of criticism for being fairly incremental, and the criticism is that the solutions that usually design thinking comes out with are kind of somewhat linear and not really reimagining the space and so on, right? So, but I do believe that in a lot of areas where you're expanding into adjacencies, where you're trying to discover unmet needs and maybe branching into trying to address latent needs, the structured way of doing design thinking process, using your storyboards, your empathic maps, and ethnographic studies, etc., to build the hypothesis, do a prototype and validate, etc., is, I think, very, very useful, right? So, of course, Alan Zhang from WeChat probably has a vision for what the product should be in his mind, and then he would pretty much kind of like convey that to his product org, and there is a single architect for that vision, and sometimes those kind of products get the benefit of that single architect through the coherence that come through in the product. Many times when you do iterative design with various parts of the platform being owned and iterated on by different product teams, and they're purely relying on design thinking methodology and your usual A/B testing and experimentation based evolution of platforms, sometimes it may tend to get a little bit incoherent. So it's very important for someone who is basically able to look at it, and even if you follow a design thinking methodology, be able to maintain the overall aesthetics, design philosophy, and the value proposition of the platform to be coherent for the users. So I would say, in most cases, design thinking works pretty well for continuing to iterate, but you do need to figure out a mechanism to make sure that it is not the end all and be all of it. You need to still have some process or someone making sure that there is consistency and coherence in the overall platform as it evolves.
Great. With that, we'd like to open it up to the audience. Who'd like to go first? In the back.
In your site. So I think I'm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually doing really, really well for us. So much so that we actually are doubling down on some of the platformization components, and we are looking to roll out other languages fairly quickly. Of course, it's never a good idea to commit any dates in public forums, so I will refrain from that. But you will see fairly aggressive moves from us in the next few months on that. For example, the conversion rates that we look at, right? So we still have some portions of the platform that we still need to do some work on. For example, the pricing and promotions part of the platform is still not fully in vernacular. The payments parts are not in vernacular. Address is not in vernacular. So there are parts of the platform and critical parts of that which still need some work before they can be in vernacular. But even with those pieces missing, because we optimized obviously for go-to-market and learning from the rollout, right? So even with those pieces missing, we see a huge level of adoption from especially the north and the east belts. South, of course, I mean, there'll be little no adoption, right? But in terms of users who choose Hindi as their default language when they onboard on the platform, compared to those who do not, we definitely see a increase in the conversion rates, right? So, when I'm talking about that, it's a control group that we are not offering that option to, right? So, we have basically a set-aside control groups against which we do measures. So, we do see non-trivial level of conversion increases, which makes us believe that it's working well for our users. And we also see users who had onboarded earlier, when this option was not available, proactively switching to Hindi as the language. And the retention rate of those users, once they've switched into Hindi, is very, very high. Right? So that also makes us believe that the experience is something that they are sticking to because they really like that, right? And that resonates with them better. And we did a lot of bottoms-up groundwork to understand even which things need to be translated versus transliterated, because people did not want to see when we did user studies like a Shuddhi Hindi kind of thing, right? So clearly it doesn't really, that's not how people even converse anymore, right? So they clearly wanted to see, for example, brands and other logos and everything and keywords, etc. maintained as it is, because there is a visual recall of some of those things, right? So we did a lot of that basic grounds-up research before we built the product, and it's paying really good dividends for us. It's I would say, one of the most successful launches we have done in the recent past from the platform.
Ravi, do you have one more question? Okay, we can take it offline. We are out of time.
It should take 30 seconds max.
30 seconds, okay, 30 seconds, Ravi.
So in terms of localization, right, Flipkart is targeting for next 100 million users or 200 million users. What do you think, how big is this localization can contribute to, and what are the rest 3-4 main factors which you are trying to come up with to solve for the next 100 million users?
Yeah, I think localization, as I was talking about earlier, I think 90% of the new users are going to be from tier 2 and 3 cities. And we see adoption rates for people coming from those geos in double-digit numbers, right? So usually for new features you roll out, you don't see, you see few bips in terms of adoption rates, right? You never see the level of adoption that we are seeing now. Right, so already high single-digit percentage number of sessions on a daily basis are actually on Hindi, right? And this is only with one vernacular language rolled out, right? So this is going to be a big part of our next 200, 300 million users journey, reimagining the platform ground up, introducing elements like live streaming-based commerce, social commerce, conversational commerce, so you can do assisted commerce, right? So usually So a tier 1 audience will usually have done a lot of research. So let's say you go and try and buy a TV, right? So you would know already what it means to have Dolby Vision versus HDR versus OLED versus QLED versus whatnot, right? But usually if you go and stand and watch how a transaction happens in, let's say, a Pi or an offline store, right? The first question the person will ask the person who's coming in, they have figured out how to kind of size the person, right? Whether this is like highly researched customer who will immediately pull out the online platform and do price comparison, or is it somebody who needs assistance, right? So they will ask you questions like, like if you go buy a refrigerator, they'll ask you how many people in the household, right? And so on, and try to help you, contextually help you to make decisions, right? Those kind of things are very important for this new cohort of users that we are adding to the platform, right? So a lot of these things we need to really innovate on, and a lot of these users are the first exposure to them is not even YouTube, it's TikTok. Right, so how do you use that kind of format to do live streaming-based commerce, influencer-based commerce, etc.? Those are lots of things that we want to really innovate on. So I would say vernacular video is a big part of it, video-based commerce, content-led commerce, and voice are 3 big levers that we are thinking about when we are trying to solve for the next 200, 300 million users on the platform.
All right, thank you very much, Jay. This was a very exciting evening, great evening.
Thank you, Shantanu. Pleasure talking.
Great set of insight.